So we are starting our third unit, and the first few lessons involve inequalities and solving inequalities. So here I have hopefully a few review things, such as the inequality symbols and number lines. And if you recall, the little bar underneath the inequality symbol implies that something can include or equal to a value. And then on a number line, this is also indicated by a closed circle. So if you were using one of these two symbols, okay, so we are starting our third unit, and the first few lessons are on inequalities and solving inequalities. So I have here a couple review things, such as the inequality symbols and the way that you would write them on a number line. So if you remember, the little bar underneath the inequality symbol means that you can equal or include the value that the inequality symbol is using. And those bars also on a number line would indicate a closed circle. So both of those, either a closed circle on a number line or that little bar underneath the inequality symbol, means that you want to include a value. For this number line here, you would say x, so x would represent any number, any solution. X is less than or equal to 3. So again, notice that there is a closed circle and that the inequality or the number line is shaded to the left because it's less. Over here on the left, these, the greater than and less than symbols without the bars, those would be more like the number line on the left because you have an open circle, meaning you do not want to include the number that is involved with the inequality. So in this case, that would be the number 4. So we're going to write x is greater than, because we're shading to the right, so all the numbers larger than 4. Okay, so then that brings us to our new topic, which is how to write something instead of using a greater than or less than symbol, how to write it in something called interval notation. And again, this will relate to open and closed circles on a number line, or the greater than or greater than and equal to symbols. So the inequality symbol and the number line graph, the open closed circle on that, will relate to this notation. So as you can see in the table, there's going to be two different parentheses that we can use. So one is like the rounded parenthesis that we typically use when we're typing. And then the second one is a bracket. So the bracket, if you're going to use that, then that means you want to include a number. And kind of what helps me with this is that the little bar underneath the less than symbol I just wrote is kind of like the bars on the bracket. So everything's kind of, it has those straight lines. In the example that we have down there, you're probably going to see the inequalities written a lot like this. So if you notice, you need 2 numbers to write interval notation. So you need 2 values, because your interval has to say we start at one value, comma, end at this value. And notice the picture here, it says that the lower point or the smaller value has to be on the left. It has to start the interval. And then the higher number needs to be on the right because it needs to end the interval. So that is really important that you have those in the right order, because that's just kind of a normal way to write anything, is like the smaller, comma, larger. So then the second thing to note is that you can mix the type of parenthesis that you're going to use. So in this case, because this symbol here was a less than symbol, they used the parenthesis. And then on this side, because they had the less than or equal to symbol, they used the bracket because we did want to include the 2. And again, on the number line, we have an open circle because we're not including it, and we have a closed circle here at 2 because we do want to equal the 2. And here we have just a few examples. Why don't you go ahead and pause the video so that you can look at these. Okay, so one thing to note that we haven't mentioned yet, so the first handful here, these are similar to our example on the previous page, where if I give you an inequality or a number line graph, you can see the first number that the graph or the inequality starts with, and you can see the last number. Now, this last set down here, the inequalities only have one value, such as 3. So then what should be the other number in the interval? Because as I said before, you have to have 2 values. So depending on the direction that your number line or that your inequality is pointing, the other number that you're going to use is a infinity symbol or a negative infinity symbol. So for these first 2, if you look at the number line, I'm going to try to zoom in a little bit more. If you look at the number line, so since the arrow is pointing to the left, there really is no beginning number, so we would call that negative infinity. And then over here on the right side, like for this first one, the number line ends at 3. So those would be the 2 numbers I want to use in my interval, negative infinity and then comma 3. And then with the infinities and negative infinities, you will always use the rounded parenthesis because it's not an actual number that you can equal or you can include. It's a bunch of numbers, so you want to use that rounded parentheses for the interval. And then on the left side here, for these 2 examples, the 3s had different parentheses because one was an open circle and the other was a closed. Okay, so same thing here with these last 2 pictures. So I can see the number line starts at -1, but then it keeps going and going further and to the right. So if you think about the right side would be positive. So these are positive infinity that they keep going to, because I have to have 2 numbers. So what could possibly be the second number? Again, we're going to be using infinity symbols. So for both of these, they start at -1, and then they end. Well, they never end, so we're going to use infinity to imply that. And again, notice that the infinity symbols use the round parenthesis because it's not there's not a single actual number that you can equal. And then in this case, because the positive infinity is on the right side, it is the larger number, so that is listed second in the interval. Okay, so again, if your inequality is pointing to the left or your number line is pointing to the left and you only have one value marked off on the number line, you want to use a negative infinity to start the interval. If your inequality is pointing to the right or your number line is pointing to the right, you want to use positive infinity as the second value in your interval. So then you have 2 values. You have them in order of the lowest number and then the highest number. And finally, with the parentheses and brackets, the infinity symbols will always have a parenthesis. Okay, and then last but not least here for interval, inequality notation, number lines, all of this. So for this example, we haven't seen one like this where you have two different inequalities, because if the first slide on interval notation, it was one inequality, but it had two values written in it. So in this case, we have x is less than -1. So if I go down to my number line, this would indicate an open circle at -1, and then less than would mean to the left. Notice what direction the inequality is pointing and my number line is pointing. Or, so this is actually a separate piece on my number line, or x is greater than or equal to 4. So if I mark that off, and then this would actually be a filled in circle, and since it says greater numbers are to the right. So that's my number line. And then how would I write this in interval notation? So you have two different intervals. So you're going to have two different interval notations. And again, you're just going to have to figure out what's the lower number in the interval and what's the higher number. And then do I use parentheses or brackets? Okay, so just kind of the general idea of which ones go with which. So over here on the left, it looks like, and I have an easier time doing interval notation when I have a number line. I think that's way you can see like the smaller number and then the larger number. So because it's pointing to the left, then the beginning number in this interval must be -infinity because there is no actual like low end. And then it stops at -1. And since that is an open circle, I'm going to use a parenthesis for -1. And as we discussed, infinity symbols will always have a parenthesis. Okay, over here on the right side, because the 4 begins this part of the number line with a solid dot, I'm going to have a bracket here at 4. And then the number line keeps going to the right. So it keeps going on towards positive infinity using a parenthesis. And then the one little notation piece that we need to keep in mind here is if you do have two separate intervals that you're writing down for your answer, we don't separate them with a comma. What we actually use is a little symbol. It's a little U, or kind of like a U, and that means union. And that's a way to join two separate intervals together. So that's the mathematical way of saying like this or that.